Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar looking at the Accreditation of Customs Brokers, brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Executive Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host today. And today's topic is an incredibly important one, touching, as it does, on the professionalisation of the customs and trade industry. This is something that is at the heart of much of the work that the Institute undertakes around the world. And the possibility of introducing standards for the sector in the UK was also a key element of the package of customs measures announced by the Chancellor alongside the spring budget earlier this year. So it's something that's clearly being looked at by the government as well, as we shall soon find out. But on the next slide, it's my delight to welcome today's speakers, and with us today to explore the issues of the customs intermediary accreditation and to explain the ongoing public consultation on this are Mark Maguire, the Head of Customs Intermediaries Policy at HMRC, Kevin Shakespeare, the Institute's Director of International Strategic Projects, and a familiar voice to many of you, I am sure. And later on, when we get to the Q&A, we'll also be joined by Susie Daly, Head of External Affairs at the UK Accreditation Service, or UCAS for short. And in fact, Susie, do you want to introduce yourself and UCAS at this point? Susie.
Thank you very much, Will. First of all, it's lovely to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to join. As Will said, I'm Susie Daly. I'm External Affairs Manager at UCAS, which is the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. So we're the national accreditation body for the UK, and as such, we're the only accreditation body that's recognised by government, and we're underpinned by regulation. And accreditation in this context is the attestation of the competence of bodies that perform certification and other conformity assessment activities. So I look forward to hearing and joining the debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Susie. Hopefully not a debate, hopefully a conversation, but it's great to have you with us and great for that information as well. But on the next slide, before we get into the main presentations, Kevin is going to give us a quick overview of today's topic. And so yeah, over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Will, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. What we will cover today, effectively, we're going to look about high-level information about the intermediary standard and around improving compliance awareness. As has just been indicated, we're very much going to look at professionalisation of the industry, aspects around training and education, the role of accreditation services and schemes in improving quality of service, and also look at support from the Institute of Export and International Trade. So as Will just indicated, the theme and the topic around accreditation was addressed in the 2023 spring budget, along with other customs measures and reference to other consultations. And it raises two very important questions. How can we improve the quality of service offered by all customs intermediaries in the UK? And there is a focus clearly on the word all there. So really, we want to ensure that high quality of service across the whole industry. And can we create a standard to enable a level playing field? So, as we talk around a lot in the Institute, we strongly believe in a level playing field for customs and trade and all aspects of import and export. So at that, I'll pass back to Will. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And now on the next slide, as regular Institute webinar attendees will know, we like to make these sessions pretty interactive. So I'm going to launch the first poll. This one is asking, you're trying to get a sense of what you know at the moment about the consultation currently underway. So it's a relatively straightforward yes/no question. Are you aware of the government consultation on proposed voluntary accreditation standards for customs intermediaries? While you're answering that poll, some quick housekeeping notes from me. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window, which is usually to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions towards the end of today's sessions, though please note we cannot guarantee we will get to every question in the allocated time. As such, I will be prioritising questions that have relevance to the wider audience, so I won't be going into company or sector-specific queries as such. And please do note that if your questions are short and clear, I am more likely to be able to read them. Finally, you will receive a recording of the webinar with a copy of the slides in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. I can see that most of you answered the poll, so I'll just give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and let's see the results. So 2/3 of you say yes, you are aware of the government consultation, and 36% of you say you are not. Thank you everyone for responding to that poll. Interesting to see that so many of you are aware of the consultation, and hopefully we can build on that by the end of today's session. But on the next slide, it's time for the first major presentation of the webinar. For this, I'm going to hand over to Mark McGuire, the Head of Customs Intermediaries Policy at HMRC. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Will, and thank you for inviting me to talk at this webinar today. So my plan for this session was to briefly run you through some of the government thinking around introducing a potential voluntary standard for customs intermediaries and how we got to this point. So if we could go to the next slide. As Will and Kevin mentioned, we ran a call for evidence in 2022, which looked at transit, simplified declarations and customs intermediaries, and was aiming to really get a sense of how the sector was operating at that point after stage customs controls had been brought in. As part of that call for evidence, things we were hearing from both traders and from customs intermediaries was that there is sufficient capacity in the sector. So by capacity, I mean enough customs intermediaries to process declarations that are needed, but there were some issues around quality in the sector. So while the vast majority of customs intermediary did offer a good service, there were some areas where there could be improvements made. And so that's really focused our policy attention on what could we do to improve quality across the whole customs intermediary sector. So just to talk a bit about our objectives for a voluntary standard. So like I said, we want to improve quality across the entire sector, but to do that, we really think that we need buy-in from industry. We need to develop something that would actually be used by industry and benefit industry. And when I'm talking about industry here, I mean the whole suite of everyone involved with imports and exports. So yes, I mean customs intermediaries, but I also mean traders who use a customs intermediary and ultimately consumers who get the products from traders. We absolutely think anything that we develop needs to be accessible to intermediaries and traders. So not a very detailed list only, we'd want to bring that to life with examples of how it might operate in practice. And we really want to enable traders to make more informed choices. So one of the common themes that's come across within all of my conversations with traders is that they find it difficult to identify who the really good quality customs intermediaries are. And that's one of the objectives that we're seeking to address through introducing a voluntary standard that would help traders to identify which ones are the really good quality customs intermediaries that have policies and practice in place to really facilitate trade. So if we could go to the next slide, please. When we've been considering this, we've been thinking about approaches on a kind of spectrum, and you can see this here. There's a version of it within the consultation. And at one side on the left, you've got market-led solutions, which is largely where we are at the moment, where you seek industry to develop their own practices and really improve the sector. And that goes along a spectrum of oversight, where at the very far right, you've got things like licensing. Many of you will be aware that in the US, for example, they have a robust system of licensing where you need a licensed customs broker in order to operate customs processes. So when we were thinking about this, based on the evidence that we got last year in the call for evidence, we feel there is a case for government intervention, and that should be more than market-led solutions. And so we considered information and guidance and codes of practice. However, that doesn't give a really strong sense of assurance of the quality of the customs intermediary, and we do feel there's an appetite for that. And so the consultation proposes introducing certification and accreditation as a way of raising standards in the sector of being really clear what best practice means for customs intermediaries, and to have a marker that can really help you identify who the good quality customs intermediaries are. And if we move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about how it would work in practice. So what we envisage is certification. The customs intermediary could apply to a certification body to make an assessment of that intermediary to see if they meet the standards that we set. That certification body would then be accredited by the UK Accreditation Service to ensure that they're applying those standards in an equitable way, that they're competent to do so, and that they've got a really clear scheme for becoming certified. And I think Susie will say a little bit more about that later. So briefly, just to touch on how we would develop the standards. So we absolutely see this as a process of meaningful co-design. So working with people like yourselves who are on the call, and working with industry to really work through what is it that makes a good customs intermediary and what should best practice be. And we want to work with industry over a period of 12 or so months to really get that right. So we've got specific, measurable and objective criteria as to what makes a good customs intermediary that we can develop into a robust standard, and that standard could then be certified by certification bodies, with the certification bodies then accredited to deliver that certification. So the whole, if we could go to the next slide, so the whole consultation is all about raising standards within the customs intermediary sector, really promoting best practice across the sector and understanding what that means for traders, and working closely with industry to make sure we get it right. And very briefly, the consultation is currently live. It closes on the 30th of August. And we very much encourage people to submit a formal response, because that will make sure that we can take those into account in the analysis of the consultation. And if you do have any detailed questions, and we can circulate this email address in the follow-up email, we very much welcome questions to our central mailbox as well if we don't get to all of them today. And that's customs intermediaries consultation at hmrc.gov.uk. But that's the government proposal, and we're working through the consultation today. So I'm very excited to be invited today to talk about that.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Great to hear so much going on, so much thought going into this from HMRC, and obviously the consultation is a great opportunity for our members, but also the wider trader and customs intermediary sector to get involved in informing it. Before we do get on to Kevin's presentation, we're going to do another poll, another chance for you to have your say about what your views are. And this one is asking, do you agree that voluntary standards for customs intermediaries would improve compliance and the quality of services? Options there ranging from improving compliance or just improving quality of services, might improve both, may not improve either, or you may not know. So I'll give you all a few minutes to answer that poll. And Mark, just while people are answering that, a question we've had in from Samantha already, and it kind of gets to the heart, I guess, of the presentation you just gave. And she asks, how can voluntary accreditation for customs intermediaries enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of cross-border trade? So I guess what are the big benefits? And I'd be interested to hear this from maybe from a business's perspective as well as from the intermediary side.
Yeah, so we know that 99% of traders use a customs intermediary to submit their declarations into government. So if you're importing or exporting goods, you're highly likely to use the customs intermediary to facilitate your trade. At present, we don't have any clear set best practice that's agreed across the industry with set standards and expectations, both for the quality of service and the compliance regime. So the proposal to introduce a standard for customs intermediaries and really aim for consistency across the sector will help improve that import and export process for traders. And ultimately, if we improve the service that's offered by customs intermediaries to traders, then we would like to see perhaps fewer errors and maybe goods fewer goods being held up at ports, for example. So it all feeds into the wider trade ecosystem of improving customs intermediaries should improve the processes for imports and exports overall.
Thanks, Mark. And a question we've just had in from Patricia, she raises AEO, which is obviously something which has been around for a long time, and is already in this sort of space in terms of accrediting companies with a certain status or level of best practice in customs performance. How does all of this sit in relation to AEO, do you think?
That's a good question, Patricia. So AEO is currently the standard that's available to customs intermediaries and traders who operate within the customs environment, and is largely most useful for those that operate with a high volume of trade. We do see AEO and a voluntary standard for customs intermediaries as being distinct. So AEO provides access to certain facilitations, for example, simplified declarations. That wouldn't be the case for a voluntary standard. But AEO is very much focused on having the right processes in place, whereas a voluntary standard would also look at a broader suite of things. So for example, customer service levels and continuous professional development. And it would be really focused on the customs intermediary sector in particular. So we do see them as being complementary, and we absolutely do see AEO as being a good thing for people to get if they're operating within the customs space. But we think there's space for AEO alongside a voluntary standard for customs intermediaries. I should also say, if you have AEO and you've provided evidence into government and you do your regular internal audits, then proving that you meet the standard for a voluntary standard could potentially be much simpler for those types of organisations because they'd have evidence already available to them.
Interesting. Thank you, Mark. I hope that's been useful, Patricia. So yeah, that's great stuff. I'm just going to share the results to the poll. Thank you everyone again for answering. 60% of you say it will improve both. A tenth of you say it will just improve compliance, or 7% just quality of services. Only 14% of you don't think it will improve either. 10% don't know at this stage. Mark, I would have been surprised if the answer had been that it wouldn't improve either. Is that poll result about what you would have expected?
I think so, and it's encouraging. I think for us to get that improving both compliance and quality of services, it's really important that industry and traders engage with us when we're developing the detail of it, because that's exactly what we're aiming to do. So very, very glad to see that.
Great stuff, and thank you everyone for responding to the poll. As ever, this information is incredibly useful for the Institute, for HMRC, and hopefully it will help to form a part of a consultation response from the Institute and also more broadly. So thank you, Mark, for the presentation just now. We'll go on to the next slide, and I'll hand over to Kevin to explore in a little bit more detail what this might mean for the industry. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, and can I also thank Susie and Mark for agreeing to take part in the webinar today. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go through sort of several themes and several concepts, and I'd like to perhaps look at this slightly differently in terms of what it means for the industry and the entire trade community, because as Mark says, this is about the whole industry, the importers, the exporters, the freight forwarders, the brokers, the intermediaries, the CSPs, and everyone in the industry itself. So what could it mean for the industry? So by creating a benchmark and a professional standard for all intermediaries, we can give those intermediaries the opportunity to showcase to their clients, their customers, that the broker, the intermediary, has good internal procedures and professionally trained staff as well. So effectively, it gives that the accreditation means something to the broker, but it also means something to the trader, the clients using the services of the intermediary. If we have a next slide, please. So one concept I think which is interesting and worth considering is this concept, if you like, of a merit-based system for accreditation. So consideration potentially, we've used the word there, grandfathering rights in achieving accreditation. And there's a couple of options that could apply there, but as we said, only for consideration, only a thought. So using recognised qualifications such as, for example, the UK Customs Academy, which we will refer to in the next slide. We've had reference in a question on authorised economic operator, which, as we've looked at, is different, both AEOS, safety and security, and C, customs simplification. And some really good points were made by Mark in the answer there. The concept of trusted trader scheme. So clearly trusted trader is a term that we're starting to hear more about with the likes of the border target operating model, and also bringing in the whole point around customs authorizations and simplifications as well. So for example, if you have the likes of inward processing, customs warehousing, and other authorizations there. So something to be considered there in terms of a merit-based system. If we have the next slide, please. So let's just reflect on the importance of training and education, because in the schemes globally, training and education is really, really important in the accreditation of brokers. And I think as traders, we all want to see qualified brokers and to effectively improve and provide a good international trade supply chain journey. So effectively, the importance of training and education is to provide and assist the clients, the customers, with compliance, and for the brokers intermediaries to have a detailed knowledge of new laws, regulations, and trade policies. So clearly, I think, has been indicated, CPD, continuing professional development, is really important to this. And we can see that in the number of initiatives taking place in the UK and globally. So, for example, in the UK with the likes of transit, modernising authorisations, the single trade window, border target operated model, and so on. But globally, increasingly new laws and regulations around carbon, around digital product passports as well, and true origin of goods. So it's important that the industry has that both existing knowledge, but that up-to-date knowledge, so they can support their customers and clients. So as international trade develops, and clearly, for example, with the UK, the new free trade agreements being negotiated and signed, so should the demand for customs brokerage professionals as well. So a professional education, accredited education, becomes really important. So customs intermediaries and brokers who have completed the necessary qualifications are likely to be seen by the industry and by traders, clients, as more reliable, and therefore more likely to generate new business. Now, in a couple of slides' time, I'm going to refer to the results so far of the Institute survey. But just a quick snippet here before I come on to the slide, that 91% of our survey respondents to date believe that undergoing training and possessing qualifications are important for achieving voluntary standards for intermediaries. And that's quite a compelling figure in terms of that 91%. So if we have a next slide, please. So just up here as an example of a recognised professional qualification is the UK Customs Academy. And this was developed at the request of HMRC. Now, clearly the Institute of Export and International Trade are involved with several other organisations, but also there's the involvement of the World Customs Organization, WCO, as well. We can see a number of levels there in terms of if you say educational qualifications. So many of you will be familiar, and we hope many of you on the actual webinar will have completed qualifications from the UK Customs Academy. So you have level 2, which is more entry level, through, for example, to level 4 and level 5, which are level 4 is in UK terms is the equivalent of a first year of a degree, level 5 the equivalent of a second year of a degree. So we can see the different levels there, but again, that learning about the background to how customs operates at a global level, at a UK level, but also that ongoing learning that's embedded in the UK Customs Academy is really important for this ever changing face of both world customs and UK customs as well. So if we have the next slide, please. So we recognise clearly that we very much want a level playing field across the whole industry, as I said earlier. So both importers, exporters, all actors in the international trade journey can compete on a level playing field. And that very much applies for customs intermediaries as well. We recognise clearly that potentially for SME brokers that it could potentially be, if you like, harder to achieve standards. So we very much want to support the whole community, including the SME customs brokers, to actually acquire the benefits of accreditation. We want it to be available for everybody. So, for example, some of our proposals and thought process here is an online information service, which the Institute clearly would be happy to be involved in to help those smaller organisations get ready for accreditation. To facilitate the communication between brokers and the regulatory authorities as well. So it can work, and we very much want to help small businesses and small brokers. An example of that would be post-EU exit. There was an SME voucher scheme which was quite heavily used, including from our perspective, including use of the UK Customs Academy, which was focused on SMEs only, and devising specific programs really shows that SMEs can become engaged, and we want SMEs to really take advantage in the same way that SMEs may find it hard to achieve AEO status for safety and security and other areas. We want to help SME businesses benefit from the world of trade and not just be available for the larger businesses. If we have a next slide, please. So just quickly turning to the results from our survey, and as I would stress, the survey is still open, and details of how to access the survey will be provided on the next slide. But we sort of wanted to sort of get a quick view of this webinar, where we were on the survey results from our members, but also the wider community. So clearly the Institute of Export and International Trade, Open to Export, UK Customs Academy, to really get the view of the entire industry. So let's just pick out some of these points here. So over 93% of survey respondents, which again was from across the whole industry, large businesses, small businesses, traders, intermediaries, freight forwarders, and CSPs and so on, believe that the primary objective for introduction of these standards is to promote quality and consistency amongst customs intermediaries to improve the overall quality of service. Market professional recognition, competitive advantage, and support to drive the quality across the sector are seen as the biggest benefits of accreditation. So again, the market professional recognition is really seen as one of the biggest benefits. Over 69% of survey respondents use external training to upskill their staff in customs education. And just at this stage, I want to draw a slight distinction between training courses and qualifications, because it's a question we get at the Institute. Well, what is the difference? Because courses can be used as training courses, sometimes people refer to it, sometimes courses are referred to as qualifications. So there is a difference. Qualifications means, or professional qualifications should mean that you are accredited by a national qualification accreditation body. So in the UK, that's Ofqual, who provide that accreditation. So effectively, you are externally accredited, and you have external examining boards and so on to actually support it. So hence, qualifications are more accredited and clearly receive that greater government recognition than as opposed, for example, to a 1 or 2 day training course. And finally, over 73% of respondents believe that voluntary customs intermediary standards should be subject to independent third-party verification. Now, as you say, I'm sure there'll be a question for Susie later on this. Just in the same way that qualifications should be externally verified by regulators, again, 73% of respondents believe that voluntary customs intermediary standards should be subject to independent third-party verification. So if we just move to the next slide, and the final slide for me now, what you'll see here is details of how to access the survey. Can we thank those the community who have completed the survey today? Your feedback, as always, is greatly appreciated, and there's been some really, really good comments and feedback. And clearly, we would encourage you, clearly there's a government consultation, but also to provide us at the Institute with your views, so we can represent the whole entire ecosystem of trade. So I'm going to pass back because I think there's another poll question. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. If we can keep it on the QR slide for just a minute, just give people a bit more of an opportunity to scan it. I have posted the link in the chat as well. But Kevin, just while giving people that opportunity, one thing which rose to my mind is obviously we've done a lot of webinars recently about, you know, the initiatives going on to digitalize trade. Obviously with electronic trade documents bills, now the Act that got all sent last week, the support of type operating model, single trade window, ecosystem of trust, all these really exciting things. How much do you think standards like these really underpin that creation of this sort of broader ecosystem of trust? How important is this towards that?
Yeah, I think it's very important. So, I mean, I think we're on record, the Institute, as saying that we welcome these initiatives. We welcome trade facilitation. We must remember a lot of trade facilitation is coming from the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, and it's not just the UK that is introducing these exciting initiatives. But what the UK is doing is ambitious, but ultimately it's there to facilitate free trade and support trade, but it has to be legitimate trade, clearly. So clearly within this, that the more accreditation, the more quality assurance is really good. So this is really an important part of it. Yes, you could argue it's just another really important initiative, but it's really the sort of cornerstone, because as Mark says, 99% use brokers. Brokers are really, really important to how trade and customs function, how import and export function. So this is a sort of a key cornerstone to support professionalization in the industry and to help the importers and exporters themselves. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. If we do move on to the next slide, we will launch that poll now. This one is asking how important you think training and education for voluntary customs intermediaries accreditation is. The answer options should be relatively self-explanatory. And just while people are answering that question, Kevin, I'll do another question for you at this stage. It's one from Darren, who asks, what role can the Institute of Export and International Trade play in promoting and supporting the implementation of voluntary customs intermediaries standards?
Well, certainly as far as say the Institute's concerned, we're very much in favour of professionalisation across the whole industry, and clearly the customs intermediary accreditation is very much part of that professionalisation process. So what we would obviously like to do, sort of on behalf of the industry, is represent the views of the whole industry, but not just as segments and sectors on their own, but very much the intermediaries, the customs clients, the CSPs, all working together and communicating. So not looking as part of the industry as a silo, but working together. The best customs broker service will be where they work closely with their clients and their customers, and it's a very interactive relationship. So we want to encourage that, and we want to encourage the industry to contribute. And as Mark says, it's very much about co-design as well, very much supporting that co-design process, recognizing what works best for the entire industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That definitely seems to be the spirit of this webinar. It's a really collaborative approach between industry stakeholders and you, the audience here today. So I want to thank everyone for responding to that poll. 87% of you said that training or education would be important for the voluntary accreditation. That's a pretty high percentage, 87%. And then only 3% not very important, 3% not at all important. Over 93% of you think it's important, at least to some extent. Kevin, that really enforces what you were saying a few minutes ago. Training is going to have an important role in this potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also have to look at it that the UK is competing on a global landscape as well, and we can talk about lots of examples about customs broker accreditation in other countries of the world. But clearly the fact is that training and education, professional qualifications are very much a key part of that accreditation. I think it's important that, from the UK perspective, even if we think about things like foreign direct investment, that FDI investors from other countries and exporters from other countries also have that confidence that we have professional standards in place.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone once again for answering that poll. But we'll do a few minutes now of Q&A, the next slide. So it's a great opportunity to put your questions to our brilliant panel of Kevin, Susie and Mark. Please do type your questions in using the GoToWebinar control panel. And just a reminder, please do try to keep your questions relatively short and broadly relevant to the whole audience. That will make it more likely for your questions to be asked. First question, though, is to Susie. It's a double-parter, Susie, so forgive me for that, but it comes from Helena. And Helena asks, how does accreditation support the use of voluntary standards? And what is the difference between certification and UCAS accreditation?
Okay, thanks a lot, Will. Thanks for the question, Hannah. So, okay, initially, just an initial point of clarification. So when we're talking about accreditation, we are talking in the context of conformity assessment, which I mentioned earlier. When Kevin was talking about accreditation of qualifications, that's not something that UCAS gets involved in. But okay, so certification, that's the kind of the independent third-party assessment of a business or organisation that they're meeting the requirements of a standard or set of requirements on a continuing basis. And what accreditation is the attestation that that body that's doing the assessing of the customs intermediary is competent to do so against an international standard. So we would be assessing their competence to do the assessment. We're checking the checkers, if you like. And I suppose I would argue that accredited certification provides an extra level of assurance. I mean, we're sort of so the only accreditation body that's recognised by governments. So we're operating on a not-for-profit basis, and it's a way, I suppose, of the service user being able to kind of distinguish between the service offered by different sort of by different sort of customs intermediaries if they're certified by a body that's been accredited by us. I think you mentioned also, Hannah, how does it support voluntary standards? Well, voluntary standards, obviously, they're, because of the sort of standard development process, they're a great way of actually kind of being able to kind of deliver measurable outcomes that actually involved all the key players in their development. So whether that's kind of traders directly, whether that's the kind of customs intermediaries, government, other end users, it's that sort of kind of building my consensus process, I think, which means it's going to be something that's delivered that's appropriate. And also, again, having that sort of extra level of assurance helps to make sure that the requirements are actually being met and complied with. I don't know if that hopefully answers your question, Hannah.
It seems quite comprehensive. I don't know, Kevin, Mark, anything to add?
Long-winded, wasn't it?
No, comprehensive. That's a much more accurate word, I think. It's a great answer. And anything to add, either of you have panelists? Exactly.
No, I think the only thing to add, I think it's important, as we say, to have that recognition, and as I said, the last point I made, to think about it internationally, is that international perception as well as that UK perception is also very important.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Kevin, that obviously many questions developed here in the UK, they end up becoming international standards. So they grow into international standards. So that again can sort of further down the line maybe sort of help with the interoperability and acceptance and mutual recognition process. So.
Yeah, and part of my thinking is also certification with accreditation really would build a credibility of a standard and mean that traders and intermediaries could trust the implementation of the standard. So it really does push us towards the professionalization of the industry, as Kevin mentioned earlier as well.
Thank you all of you. And we've got another question, just a slightly different perspective on the international aspect of this. It comes from Hester, who's had a degree from the University of Canberra in international customs law. And I think the gist of his question is he's trying to figure out, if he's got this degree, which is obviously accredited in Australia to a very high standard, how's that going to fit in the UK context with the new accreditation kind of process coming in? Mark, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so at present, we're consulting on the principle of introducing a voluntary standard. We want to work with the industry to get the detail right and to work that through. But in principle, if a degree from the University of Canberra does show that you've got really strong understanding of how customs works, how imports and exports work, I don't see any reason why, just because it was awarded in a different country, it wouldn't be valid as evidence of competence within the customs world. The detail we'd work through with industry, and we'd want to understand how different qualifications could feed into it. But I'd certainly say it as being really great evidence that you understand customs and what should be done.
Kevin, I'm interested in your viewpoint of this as well, because obviously the Institute's worked with the Centre for Customs and Excise as part of the Customs Academy. So yeah, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think just to probably echo what Mark says, we obviously know University of Canberra very well. We know Professor David Widdowson very well, and we work with David. So it's probably an easier question for me to answer in that they are one of the preeminent universities. There are only a couple in the world. I hope I'm obviously not going to mention the other universities. There is one in Europe, but we would sort of take everything into account in that regard. And the Institute work obviously with a number of customs universities and the World Customs organisations across the world anyway. So we know who all these universities are. Thank you.
So could I just add something to that, Will? And that's just Kevin touched upon it earlier as well. I mean, qualifications are very important, but that's not the sole way, obviously, of demonstrating competence. As Kevin noticed, that we'd be looking for people to, CPD records. What's the organisation doing to maintain the training and development? Witnessing people, can they actually perform the activities? All those kind of things are competence is broader than the qualifications. That's my point, really, but important nevertheless.
Thank you. Thank you all, Ophelia, and Kevin, very diplomatic as well there. We've had a comment in from Derek, who says most customs brokers act as direct representatives, so responsibility still rests with the importer exporter. I wonder if we can also unpack the kind of direct versus indirect responsibility and kind of where that might end up going in this field as well. Mark, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so a trader can appoint a customs intermediary either on a direct or an indirect representative basis. Depending on how they're appointed, that has implications for whether the customs intermediary is held jointly and severally liable should there be errors within the declaration that they submit. However, no matter which way you're appointed, if the customs intermediary is acting in bad faith, or is submitting data that they should have known was incorrect, or deliberately making errors, they can still be held jointly and severally liable for any customs debt that ensues from that. So it's not as straightforward as one way of representing a trader leaves all the responsibility on the trader. It's a little bit more nuanced in how the systems actually operate. We're developing the kind of principle of a voluntary standard, and I think I've said it before, but when we get into the detail of developing exactly what will be included within the standard, we would want to represent both direct and indirect representation within the context of that standard, so we understand what makes a good indirect representative intermediary, similarly to what makes a good direct intermediary. So it's one to work through more over the course, subject to the outcome of the consultation, but certainly something that we've got in mind and we're thinking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And Kevin, I'd be interested to hear your view on this as well. As someone obviously works with a lot of businesses and intermediaries in the sector, what are you hearing in terms of what companies are thinking about the direct v indirect representation?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think just before I answer that, just like to very much agree with Susie that clearly standards are very much, the processes are really, really important part of this, and the business being able to demonstrate those processes. So that becomes really key as part of the standard. On the intermediary side, I think probably I think Mark answered it very well. Is probably just to add, I think, and it's a question we get a lot during other webinars, is an understanding about effectively that depending on whether it's direct or indirect representation, that the trader has to be aware in the customs declaration that they are liable obviously depending on direct versus indirect there, but they are liable for the information that goes in that customs declaration. So whether that's the origin of the goods, the classification of the goods, the customs valuation, and other aspects as well. So it's important that, irrespective of that, traders must realise this. And even in the accreditation of customs intermediaries, traders will still be liable and responsible. So it's really important that traders sort of recognise that point. And also from an intermediary perspective, and I'm pretty sure nearly all intermediaries will be aware of this, is to understand the differences between direct and indirect representation, so that they're not, if you like, making themselves unnecessarily liable. But liability is clearly an important part of customs. It's not just the UK, it's very much a global thing, and it goes back to how customs formed many centuries ago. So really, really important to understand that liability aspect. So whilst I'm answering the question slightly differently, it gives an opportunity to reinforce that point. So for origin, make sure you have your supplier declarations, for example.
And if I could just come in briefly, just completely agree with what Kevin said, but also to emphasize the opportunity that developing a standard could give us here. So at the moment, there's no consistency over how an intermediary tells a trader about the liability that is still on their behalf. So in developing a consistent standard to try and understand what the best practice could be for explaining liability and having some case studies could really help traders to understand their accountability in this space as well.
Terrific, thank you both. We've got time for a couple more questions. One from Sylvia. Sylvia's actually sent in 3 very, very good comments, but I'll do just one of them. And just to say that we will be looking at these after the webinar as well, and then trying to get back to you on some of these as well. So if we don't get to your question, that's not to say we're not going to respond in some way. But a question or comment from Sylvia is around actually training again, and she says more training on preferential origin and Incoterms is much needed, especially within courier companies, despite signed memorandums of understanding. I just wonder, I mean, courier companies, what's the fast parcel operators, how do they fit into all of this? I don't know, Kevin, do you want to start on that one?
Again, it's a really good question. Clearly, fast parcel operators, express operators play a very, very important role. Again, the industry we work with all the express operators, and we're keen that them, as much as any customs intermediary, can provide the service and the standard that also gives them that opportunity to demonstrate competence. So we know from the UK Customs Academy that lots of express operators put lots of their staff through the qualifications. So, and it's really just reinforcing answering the question, that the accreditation covers all types of intermediaries, whether you are an express operator, whether you are a large freight forwarder, a standalone intermediary broker. We want it to cover the whole industry, and the whole industry to have that opportunity to demonstrate competence, to demonstrate accordance with the standard.
Terrific. And we'll do one further question for Susie. This is one from Terry, who asks, what role do voluntary standards play in enhancing product quality and safety across industries?
Okay, that's quite an interesting one. Well, so I'm not from the standards body, but I would argue again that sort of the voluntary standards, because it's an agreed way of doing things, it promotes consistency and quality and can be a market driver. So I think that's the way that it helps improve quality within the market. Again, you know, if a voluntary standard is used and it's underpinned by some sort of third-party certification, ideally accredited certification, then you've got that kind of added assurance that it's actually being used consistently, that the outcomes you get is delivering the right outcomes. Yeah, I think voluntary standards particularly can help to kind of promote innovation and a more kind of innovative approach to kind of regulation as well, I think, also.
And just to come in there, thanks, Susie. So I think voluntary standards really help to set a benchmark for industries.
Yeah.
But we see that across other sectors. And at the moment, we don't have that really clear benchmark for customs intermediaries, and that's something we're really aiming towards.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Mark. And I say, because of the sort of the robust kind of standard development process, which does involve all the kind of key players, that's the way I think of actually making sure that, you know, it's something that's genuinely needed and sort of developed in the right way. So yeah, it's a measurable benchmark, isn't it?
Is it worth me saying just a moment about the British Standards Institution, who is the national standards body? So in developing a voluntary standard, one of the ways we could go about that is working with the British Standards Institution. So similarly to UCAS being the UK Accreditation Service, we also have a national body that develops standards and has really robust processes that are in place to bring together industry to come up with robust standards that would work across the different types of customs intermediary. So that's one of the routes that we're exploring, and we're speaking with the British Standards Institution regularly to understand how we might go about doing that. But in any event, we'd want to develop something that really sets the benchmark and aims towards that professionalization of the industry, with the experts helping us to develop it.
Thanks, Mark. Really important point that, and obviously, I mean, I think it was mentioned earlier, BSI, obviously globally renowned organisation, very much at the forefront of standard setting, and the standards have been adopted internationally. So it's yeah, with UCAS and hopefully the Institute and other stakeholders, we've got a great cohort of organisations looking at this. And as Steph said earlier, you can have your say through the survey as well, which I posted a link to earlier. But we're going to do one more poll on the next slide, and I will do a final question to each of the panelists as we do this poll, but just to read it out. Are you supportive of a proposal to introduce a voluntary standard for customs intermediaries? And the options are yes, no, or need more details to save away, or not sure yet. So while people are answering that poll, one to the panel, which is basically, what is the main thing you would ask people on this or in the audience today to take away from today's webinar? And Mark, as you presented first, I think over to you to start.
Yes, so for me, it would be that government's committed to raising standards within the sector and the professionalisation of the customs intermediary sector in particular. One way of doing that is introducing voluntary standards, and to really encourage members to have their say, whether it's as part of the survey that you've mentioned or as submitting a formal response into government, so that we can really take your views into account. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Definitely get involved, I think is a big message. Susie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'd echo what Mark had said, but I'd also ask people to think about what is it, what do they think are the important things that should be in a standard, really, and what would they say would be, what would be a good way of measuring compliance with that standard. So, what are the key elements that need to be in something, and how should they be measured, success be measured?
If you can't measure, you can't know if it's having any impact. So that seems very wise as well. And Kevin.
Yeah, I think just to sort of echo a point I made earlier around the industry uniting and working together, and clearly the most visible in this instance would be the traders and the intermediaries working together. And in some instances, clearly there could be different aspects of multi-trading. So it could be a freight forwarder, a haulier, an intermediary, a trader. So very much working together to ensure efficiency there. And of course, and it won't surprise you to hear this, get your Incoterms correct as well, so that it's very clear as to where responsibility and liability lies. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Always important to remember the Incoterms point. It's something which I know you've talked about on previous webinars. But to close the poll, 63% of you say yes, you are supportive. 27% of you kind of need more details either way. That's understandable. It's still in an early stage, it's still the consultation phase. Only 7% of you say no, 3% aren't quite sure yet. So thank you everyone for responding to that poll so honestly as well. Thank you. But conscious of time, so at this point I'd like to pass back to Kevin on the next slide, just say a little bit more about how the Institute is involved in professionalising trade in the UK and globally. So on the next slide, over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you everyone again for completing the poll question. So clearly the Institute's involved in a number of initiatives. We talked about AEO today already, so I'm not going to say anything more on that. Clearly CDS and the important requirements around CDS, and again, making sure that businesses, intermediaries and so on are ready. Working globally around international trade qualifications, we have a partnership with the United Nations as well in terms of international trade, import and export qualifications for developing nations and LDCs around the world. If we have the next slide, please. I guess turning to the UK, we're heavily involved in the ecosystem of trust, and the public report on ecosystem of trust should be imminent. There was the announcement of the Royal Assent last week for the Electronic Trade Documents Bill, and I think for a lot of businesses that will start to use e-documents, whichever again for the various actors in the supply chain, the likes of e-bills of lading, e-CMRs, e-bills of exchange, that is going to be another really key important aspect of trade. And we have specific training on digital trade, digital documents and legal entity identifiers as well. FTA utilisation, clearly we're working a lot with the DBT, Department of Business and Trade, on maximising FTA utilisation. So we have literally, I think, what is the final slide. As I say, you can find out more about the Institute, and I think, yeah, we've talked around helplines today. We find our member benefit of helplines and help desk really, really important to trade, where you can get hold of someone there, and also very much to work collaboratively with UK government on these various initiatives. So I'm now going to pass back to Will to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. A great overview of the Institute support and activities there. But we will now wrap up. Thank you again to Mark, to Susie, to Kevin for your comments and presentations today, and some really great conversation as well. So I hope everyone has found that useful. Just a quick flag to say that we're running our next webinar on Tuesday, the 1st of August, and that's going to be on managing risk through conducting proper due diligence into your global supply chains. So you can find out more details about that on export.org.uk, as well as all of our other upcoming events and all some of the activities and services mentioned by Kevin just then. And just to flag as well, we'll be doing webinars on things like the Electronic Trade Documents Bill and the Border Target Operating Model and so on in the autumn. A reminder that we will be sending the slides and recording of today's webinar in the follow-up email, which you should get in the next day or so. We'll include some useful links from this webinar as well, including a link to the survey. Please do get in touch if for any reason this email doesn't come through to your inbox. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar, and to our speakers once again. As you leave, please do let us know what you thought of the session and any suggestions for topics in future events by completing the short exit survey. But for now, bye-bye.